Welcome to Lesson 2. In this talk, we're going to continue our journey in the Old Testament. Last time, we saw a bird's eye view that gave us the lay of the land, especially the land of Canaan. But this time, we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. We will see the narratives of creation, the fall, the story of Cain and Abel. We have the account of the flood and Noah, and then we end today's talk dealing with the Tower of Babel. What you're going to see is that there's a pattern that develops in these early chapters. After setting the scene in paradise, fateful decisions by the inhabitants kick off what I would call a series of psychotic cycles in which they try to navigate God's good creation on their own. As these cycles unfold, we learn about both the nature of humanity and the nature of God. So let's get started. I'm going to walk you through each of these narratives, kind of summarizing the significant ideas that you may not have thought about before. Well, let's begin with the creation. We're really talking about the creation here as the original paradise. The Hebrew word bara plays an important role in this opening chapter of the book of Genesis. As a matter of fact, it's used 3 times in Genesis 1, and every time it describes God's creative activity, and it all is initiated by God. We see in Genesis 1:1, there's a creation of the heavens and the earth. In 1:21, there's the creation of the animals. And then in 1:27, we see a very special creation, the creation of human beings. In Hebrew thinking, you got to understand something. The number 3 represents the idea of completeness. So as we see in Genesis 1, these 3 uses of the word bara indicated the importance that God places on human beings in the created order. God performed his creative or his supreme work of creation when he created you and me. So that brings us to kind of ask the question then, what are the characteristics of these beings we call humans? Well, we know a few things from the text here. First, they're created in the image of God. They're different from the rest of creation. They have true personality. They have a mind, a will, and emotions that interact with each other and are able to relate to God as well. We also see that they're relational beings. They are dependent on God, and they're designed to be interdependent with one another. This is where we get the idea that's called complementarity, men and women completing each other. Well, that brings us kind of the next thought then. God set up the design in creation for human flourishing. Things were the way they were supposed to be in this opening couple of chapters actually in the book of Genesis. We see that God designed male and female, and each one to help the other. Both partners complemented and thus completed the other. There was a total vulnerability and transparency in the marital relationship. And we see here the seedbed, if you will, for the first institution designed by God, and that was the institution of the family. Of course, headed up by the marriage between one man and one woman for life. You see, this was paradise, but unfortunately, paradise only proved temporary. As we pick up with Genesis 3, we see that these image bearers are initiating a set of behaviors that would plunge the entire created order into chaos. So what we're going to see in Genesis 3 through 11 is a series of what I'm going to call psychotic cycles. These cycles are helpful because they teach us some very important things. They teach us about the nature of who we are as people today. And they teach us about the nature of who God is yesterday, today and forever. So let's take a look at this psychotic cycle briefly. We'll see that it has 4 sections, and we see it gets kicked off, and I'll go through each of one of them. I'll go through the cycle each time, but I wanted to kind of give you an overview. So let's look at the screen, and what we see is in the beginning there's a rapport between God and human beings. Now this is not the same as it was before the fall in subsequent cycles, but there's a period where folks tend to be getting along better with God, let me put it that way, because they're actually fulfilling some of the things that He's intended or designed them to do, that kind of thing. But here's the inevitable cycle. There's a period of rapport, but then as human beings, we decide to rebel. And as we rebel, there are always repercussions. We are God's creatures living in God's world under God's rules. And when we rebel against those rules, there are consequences to be paid. But the thing that I really want to hammer home in our talk today is you need to really look at how God responds. Yes, there are consequences. There are repercussions. But there's also always restoration for His people. And so with that cycle in mind, let's take a look at Genesis 3. We'll call it cycle 1, and it's the fall. In Genesis 3, we see that God's prohibitions, we find this out in Genesis 2, where He gives them a fairly simple requirement. He says, look, don't eat of this one tree. And God's prohibition here was not designed as a restriction as much as it was designed to help humanity perpetuate flourishing and maintaining their dependence on God. But see, in rebelling against God, when Adam and Eve chose to eat the fruit, in their bid for independence, they destroyed their relationship with Him, and as a result, they destroyed themselves. And not only, when we go back to that scene where there's the 3 individuals, you've got Adam and Eve, but you got the serpent in there as well. And we see that they've gone from this total vulnerability and transparency before God into this hiding from Him when He comes to look for them. And God comes upon the scene, and then of course the holy God is offended because of the disobedience, and He's going to yield out repercussions for that disobedience. And to the serpent, He cursed the serpent and said the serpent would crawl on his belly. And then we also see, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, but we also see the first promise of the gospel in Genesis 3:15, where God says that the serpent will basically be crushed by the heel of the seed of the woman. And we know this now as we look back on it, that heel is going to belong to none other than Jesus Christ Himself. But at this point, it's so early in the story, that's the promise we're looking forward to. We don't know that yet as we've not gotten there in this story. But there are also penalties for the man and the woman. The woman would experience pain in childbirth. And then she would also experience disharmony in the marital relationship. We see in the scriptures there that it talks about how she will continually want to control her husband, but the husband would rebel against her and would seek to dominate her. And so there would be marital strife and discord. We also see that from the man's perspective, work would no longer come easy. It would be very difficult for him from that point forward. And so we also find out for both of them then physical death would occur. Genesis 3:19 tells us that. So we see that God's good creation was tarnished by this thing we call sin that was ushered in by Adam and Eve falling for the serpent's lie in their quest to be like God and seek independence from God, which was exactly the opposite of why they were designed. And so we see that those are the repercussions. Now remember, there's always restoration. We find out later that God kills an animal, makes a sacrifice, and He clothes him, and He blesses him, and He sends him out of the garden. So we see that even in the midst of the consequences of the rebellion, God still loves and restores his people. And so that brings us to the second psychotic cycle, and that's the sons of these two, Cain and Abel in Genesis 4. Now here we see that Cain and Abel are making a sacrifice to God, and God accepts Abel's sacrifice, but he rejects Cain's sacrifice. And when you look at it closely, what you find out is this sin was not about the content of the offering. Grain offerings were made in those days, and so were animal offerings. So it wasn't about the content of the offering. It was about the content of the heart of the offerer. We see how sin has permeated the souls of those who would come after Adam and Eve. Of course, Paul talks about this in Romans 5 when he talks about how we've been infected ever since this point in time. So the posterity or the offspring of Adam and Eve were sinners, just like we are, and it continues to this day. So we see the repercussions of Cain being cast out, but we also see the restoration in the sense that God could have killed Cain, but he protected him. We see that in Genesis 4:15. He also gave Cain a new set of relationships. We see that in verse 17. And we also see that God used Cain to help build civilization. He built cities in 4:17. So once again, the psychotic cycle repeats. We have a period of everything kind of being okay, a period of rapport. We have a rebellion, we have repercussions, and then we have this somewhat of a restoration. Well, that brings us to the next narrative in these first few chapters, and that's the story of Noah and the flood in Genesis chapter 6. What we see here is that folks did not stay in a good restored relationship with God. Just a couple chapters later, we're now seeing that human beings, chapter 6, verse 5, tells us that human beings had grown increasingly wicked. Their rebellion was everywhere. And this wickedness was so bad that it just grieved God's heart, the 6th verse tells us. So God says, you know what? I'm going to start over. We're going to do this all over again. And then so he wipes out the entire earth, save for one family. And we see the glimmer of hope of the promise that was originally made in 3:15 in Genesis, that God would fix this problem. And he uses the man Noah and his family. And he uses Noah because Noah was an upright man. He wasn't a perfect man, but he believed God. He believed God when everybody else told him he was crazy. And God blessed him because Noah walked with God. Well, that brings us to our fourth cycle, our fourth psychotic cycle, and that's the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11. Before we go to chapter 11, it's important that we kind of look back on chapter 9, verse 1, because there's an important piece of information there. After all the stuff with the flood and the Noah story kind of draws to an end, God told Noah's family to fill the earth, just like he had told Adam and Eve. So the idea was to spread so that they could spread his glory throughout the entire created order. But Noah's descendants disobeyed God, and they congregated there at Babel. We see that in the 2nd verse of Genesis 11. And they wanted to build this tower to demonstrate just how great they were. Well, God cursed them by scattering them. That was the repercussion. The rebellion was building a name for themselves, disobeying God, and not filling the earth, staying in one locale, and trying to do something on their own. And so God scattered them. You'll see this, by the way, throughout the Bible, that when God scatters, it's typically a sign of his judgment, and when he gathers, it's typically a sign of his blessing. So we see here that God scatters them throughout the earth so that the tower cannot be built. And what you'll see, by the way, when we get to the book of Acts, is you will see God slowly, based on the gospel, bringing back the distant people groups throughout where they had been dispersed. So we see, though, that if we're going to complete our psychotic cycle, we've got to get back to restoration. And that's what it becomes really interesting, because that's going to kind of usher us into the next lesson. But this is where we are introduced to a genealogy that ends then in chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, which will talk about God calling a man out of Ur, at that time by the name of Abram. And this is going to be the starting point of regathering God's people. So once again, we see that even in the midst of rebellion, and even while suffering repercussions, God's people are about to be blessed again, because God is going to work on His own behalf to restore them, to fulfill the promise He made back in Genesis 3. So, with all that said, and that was quite a bit, what can we make of all of this? Well, we learn several important things. First, God's original design provided a perfect environment for human flourishing. But our rebellion ruptured our relationship with God and instead brought about floundering. And the rest of the Bible is a story of how we look in our daily lives like fish out of water flopping around on the shoreline, begging someone to come take us and gently put us back in the water. We see, though, that in spite of all of the floundering we do have the fisherman who, praise God, catches and releases. He puts us back into the place where we're designed to flourish. We are truly citizens of the kingdom. And what we see when we look back on Adam and Eve, we see the rebellion, but we see the sacrifice was made. And to follow up on the sacrifice, we see Genesis 3:15 telling us the promise that was made. So there was a restoration and a blessing there. When we see the story of Cain, we see the rebellion of murdering his innocent brother. But we see God protecting him. We see God blessing him with a family. And we see God using him, a murderer, a brother killer. We see God using him to build cities. And we get to Noah. We see that God called an imperfect person, although he was upright, he had all kinds of issues. We see Noah being the heir to that promise in the sense that God used his family through which eventually Christ will come. God's going to start over and wipe the slate clean. And then in the Tower of Babel narrative, we see that God has created some incredibly gifted creatures known as human beings that can do an awful lot. They just can't do as much as they think they can. And because of their sin, they want to be God themselves. But God shows mercy in that although He scatters them, He promises to bring them back. And through one man, a guy named Abram from the land of Ur, all of the families of earth would be blessed. Well, as we think about it, these first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis teach us a great deal about who we are and who God is. For our part, we see some very simple things, but very profound things. We see that we are rebellious, we are stubborn, we are at times unteachable, and we're almost always foolish. On the other hand, when we think about God and what do we see here? We see a God who keeps His promises He is faithful. He is fair. He is just. He is holy. He is loving. And I think when we think that through, this is the God we are all to worship. Because when we worship this God in spirit and truth, we actually fulfill the reason we were created. And as we fulfill the reason we were created, we will experience human flourishing. Now, in our next lesson, we're going to continue further through the Old Testament. We're going to see how God sets out on this long journey of restoring paradise back to his original intention. He does this by calling this man I mentioned, Abram, out of Ur, and this call will then usher in the next lesson, a section that we're going to call the patriarchs. Well, I hope this lesson has been helpful. Make sure that you follow through on all the learning activities that accompany this video, and Lord willing, I'll see you in the next time. God bless. We'll talk again soon.